Again, everyone, thanks so much for being here. We'll do another quick reminder to make sure that you are muted, and you're more than welcome to turn off your videos if you'd like. Today, we're going to be talking about the second part of teaching case studies, which is the case narrative. So after building upon the foundation of thinking about doing a teaching case study, now we're talking about one of the two critical elements in the teaching case study paradigm, and that is the case narrative. So let's get started. Now, as a quick summary from the first workshop, we want to highlight three key pieces. Of course, you're more than welcome to dig into that session and revisit some of these ideas with more scrutiny. But to lead us into today's content, what we want to really highlight is the difference between case study as a teaching method versus case study as a research method. Again, it is a challenge when authors are thinking about the case study method, but not as a teaching tool, but as an empirical research piece. And so, yes, qualitatively or even quantitatively, case studies can be actioned and actively used to develop empirical research, but this is not necessarily what we are focusing on here. What we're focusing on here is utilizing a case study to deploy in our pedagogy, to deploy in the classroom. So again, want to make sure that everyone is on the same page with that. Then the second piece is to recall that we're really focusing on problem-based learning and skills. So we really want our learners to get to a place with our case studies that there is a problem or challenge that requires a solution, because that provides that sort of modus operandi to want to dig in, not only to want to read the case, but to really want to solve the challenge for the fictional or perhaps non-fictional situation. And that can also have a knock-on effect to some of the skills that you might want those learners to have at the end of experiencing the case, whether they're more practical skills or they're more conceptual skills. So being able to critically analyze a situation, or being able to have stronger interpersonal skills, or they could be more concrete, hard skills, we'll call them, perhaps utilizing a software program. So they could be hard skills or soft skills. And then the final piece that we just want to recall from our previous workshop is this idea of the case difficulty cube. And that's where we can think about our cases and how they can be built from a conceptual, analytical, and presentation point of view. Are we, what are these practical skills that we're trying to get folks to learn? How are we presenting those ideas? How are we presenting that information? What types of analyses will they be working on? And what are the concepts that they will be digging into? So if we utilize that three-dimensional cube, or that CAP model of conceptual, analytical, and the presentation of said information, or the practicalness, the practicality rather, of that dimension, of the case, that will also allow us to get to a place where we're understanding why the teaching case will be useful, not just for us personally in our classrooms, but certainly spreading that gospel to others in sport management and other disciplines so that they can teach their students and perhaps their learners that same information as well. So knowing that background from our first workshop, now let's get into the composition of case studies. So as I alluded to off the top today, there are two critical pieces to a teaching case study. There's the case narrative and the teaching note. So in today's workshop, we're going to be talking about the case narrative. And next week, or in our third workshop, we'll be talking about the teaching note. Now, as you can see on screen, it is a balancing act. And in a perfect world, we want these two pieces to be equally balanced. It's not a situation where we necessarily want to invest all of our time into having an amazing case narrative, but a very, we'll say, weak teaching note. And by the same token, we also don't want an amazing teaching note, which is incredibly thorough, but a very sparse, a very unfortunately written, we'll use that term, case narrative that isn't compelling, that isn't captivating, and that students don't want to read, learners don't want to engage, and instructors don't want to adopt. And so we need to think about case studies from a teaching standpoint in this balancing act with having equal merit amongst both. And today we'll start with the case narrative. We'll work linear in that way, but it is something that comes up often, and we'll talk about this in our third workshop as well, as which one should you do first, or should you do both simultaneously? That's truly up to the case author, but for our purposes, we'll start with the case narrative, and then at the end of our workshops, you can sort of make your decision on what you feel is best for you. So let's get into story time. Our world is full of stories. I'm a big believer as an educator and as an instructor that we are, as far as humans are concerned and the human condition, storytellers, fundamentally, whether we're in business, whether we're in the classroom, whether we're dealing with our friends and families. We are all storytellers, and we have stories to tell. Now, some of those stories break through and resonate, and others do not. And I've got an asterisk there because there are many reasons why some stories are not championed. Some stories are often forgot and not necessarily promoted to the limelight. We're going to put that aside for a sec because that is a Pandora's box that requires a lot more time and discussion. But think about this rhetorically on your own. Think about the stories that you enjoy, whether it's a good book, whether it's a captivating song that really tugs on your heartstrings, whether it's that movie that you saw that really that you had that emotional connection and evoked some strong connective tissues with. Perhaps it's sports, seeing a particular game and having that evoke certain emotions and feelings. Stories are all around us. And again, there are some stories that seem to resonate and break through. One of the keys in our view to telling a good story is that stories that do break through and resonate often tend to be compelling, and they tend to be considerate. Okay, so what do we mean by compelling? Well, again, it can be a bit ambiguous, but what we are referring to with a compelling story is a story which is vivid, that is specific, it's colorful, it's not necessarily positivistic, it has various dimensions, complexities, it has body to it. And it's specific, it's not ambiguous. There are details, there are characters, there are storylines, there are threads within the story to pull from. In addition to being compelling, though, we also feel that good stories are considerate. They're entertaining. And so when I say considerate, I should preface, referring to consideration in terms of considerate of the audience, considerate of the characters within the story, considerate of the plot, and considerate of the authors and the perspective that they're bringing to the table. So we want stories from a consideration standpoint to be entertaining, to think about whether or not a reader, the audience, would want to draw themselves in. Would they want to keep going and read past the first paragraph? Are they engaging? Is there a plot that allows them to sink their teeth into, the audience that is, and want to keep going? So when we think about being compelling and considerate with our case narrative, it allows us to then, when we think about our foundation, if we just do a quick circle back, to think about unpacking our ask, to think about unpacking our skills, our context, our framing, utilizing these principal points of being compelling and considerate with our storytelling. And that could be quite the challenge for authors who are who are getting into the authorship of a teaching case study. And I like to use the analogy of connect the dots, which is one of the prominent tools that, from a visual arts perspective, that young learners, grades 3, 6, even upwards to 9 and 10 get into, although maybe grades 9 and 10 might be a slight bit old for connect the dots. Even to this day and age, I still enjoy connecting the dots at some points in time. And the great thing about the connect the dots scenario or analogy is that it truly helps us to unpack how we can be both considerate and compelling as we are developing our plot line, as we develop our story. And if you think about it in this way, with the connect the dots, we may have dots all over the page or a set of pages. But if we don't connect them, there is no visual to see. They're just dots on a page. If you look at the current slide on the screen, you'll see a bunch of different dots. And this is no slight on the hard sciences, by the way. But as you can see, there are different molecules all over the map. And as a non-hard scientist, I could say I have no idea what's going on. But this can tend to also emanate through certain case narratives where there are different plots, there are different threads, and not necessarily woven together in a linear or perhaps even structured manner. And so for the reader, they can look at this and go, whoa, I'm confused. I'm not really sure what's going on. And when we think about those two pieces, consideration and how compelling the narrative is, we'll tend to, those readers may tend to think that, yeah, you know what, this isn't a good case for me to want to sink my teeth into. And we can also extrapolate that to instructors who might not necessarily want to adopt that case for their courses. So we want to have a bit more structure in thinking about those properties of consideration and compulsion, or compulsion, excuse me. When we think about making a compelling narrative, when we think about a considerate narrative, we want to make sure we have a bit more structure. And so one device that we can utilize to overcome or alleviate this challenge is with Freytag's pyramid. For those of you who don't know, Gustav Freytag was a 19th century German playwright, and many of you may have seen this device utilized in other contexts, but specifically the arts, where whether you're telling a story through visual mediums or media rather, like film or television, whether you're directing a play or writing a play, you may have seen something like this, this device elements before, or this device and its elements before. But we can also harness it in our case narrative writing. And it has 6 main elements to Freytag's pyramid. It starts with the exposition phase. It hits an inciting incident, rather. Then there's a rising action, followed by the climax of the narrative, with then a brief period of falling action, meeting a point of resolution. Now, we're going to unpack each of the 6 stages of Freytag's pyramid as we go. And for your purposes, what you can think about on your end is how Freytag's pyramid may be a useful device to allow you to write your case narrative in a way that is structured, follows this linear process, but also meets the criteria to then create a compelling and considerate narrative. Now, before we unpack each of these 6 pieces, what I do want to take a moment to briefly discuss is this idea of cadence or pace. Because in Freytag's pyramid, as you can see on the left-hand side of our screen, there are the 6 stages, but there aren't any sort of ranges provided. There aren't necessarily hard concrete numbers when it comes to how long or how short should I be writing these particular pieces. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, that's the visual representation of our multiple types of distribution that we may have. Your cadence with Freytag's pyramid might be elongated. It might be a situation where the exposition and the rising action take longer to unpack. The climax isn't necessarily the pinnacle of Mount Everest, but it might be slightly lower, but still a climax phase, and then reaching a falling action and resolution phase. By the same token, or conversely, you might have a shorter distribution window with your case narrative, in which case the elements are shorter. Your exposition and inciting incident and rising action phases might be more expedited, perhaps, with a more critical climax and then a sort of steep falling action and resolution phase. So there is no one way necessarily to write your case narrative. And that's why we want to present this idea of cadence, because your cadence may vary, but ultimately, so long as your case narrative is compelling, considerate, and perhaps if you subscribe to what we are espousing today, following along this linear path of Freytag's pyramid, you might be on the right path to then decide whether or not you need a wider distribution or perhaps a shorter distribution. or maybe even a normal distribution. So let's start with the first phase, and that's the exposition phase. In this stage, the goal is to introduce the reader and audience to the overall points of the story. This is where you can introduce the protagonist or protagonists, any main characters and side characters, and perhaps that scenario or context, whether it's community sport, pro sport, women in sport, para sport, whatever that might be, and provide those snippets to the audience. And so we really want to take this opportunity to explore and ease the reader into the details, of the case. Now, today what we're going to do is through each of the stages of Freytag's pyramid, we're going to talk about a case studies in sport management example. So for our first example here in the exposition phase, we have an example written by Lindley Ingerson and her co-author team from 2020, if I'm not mistaken. It was a special issue on digital sport and communication. And this case was entitled California Streaming, Developing an Integrated Social Media Strategy to Attract Fans to a New Streaming App. In this particular case, in the early stages, in the exposition stage, to be precise, the main character, Laurie Spinks, is introduced. Now, in this particular case, it's worth mentioning that the scenario is non-fictitious, that it is based off of a real-life scenario with the Bay Area in the United States. For those of you who are unfamiliar, that's the San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area. It is utilizing NBC Sports and their specific Bay Area sports operation, and how NBC created what's known as the My Teams app for fans, to be precise, of Bay Area teams. Now, Laurie Spinks is a fictitious character who is based off of a non-fictitious person and a non-fictitious role within NBC Sports Bay Area. However, all of these details are introduced not insofar as the non-fictitious, fictitious elements are concerned, but the fact that Laurie Spinks exists, that they are the director of social engagement at NBC Sports Bay Area, what NBC Sports Bay Area does, what the My Teams app was meant to do, what the situation looks like in the Bay Area as far as apps and demographics of the fan and consumers look like. All of these details are spelled out in the exposition stage. So again, just to clarify, in this exposition stage, we're truly easing the reader in, easing our audience into the case scenario, providing the details that are critical to continue on with the rest of the story, but also providing, and it helps to anchor the case with a main character or protagonist. And as such, in this case, Laurie Spinks is that anchor point. Now, with stage two, after explaining or exploring that exposition stage, the details, the sort of finer points, the context, the scenario, then we can reach that inciting incident moment. At this juncture, the goal is to introduce a significant or perhaps impactful moment that creates a good or bad conflict for the protagonist or protagonists. And this truly sets off a series of events or actions that will unfold in the narrative, reaching that pinnacle or climax, which we'll talk about briefly in the next stage. So the inciting incident is sort of the wrap-up moment in the exposition stage, where after you provide those details, you provide the easing in, you hit a critical juncture. And again, that point, to reiterate, could be a good thing, or it could be a not so good thing. That is your choice to make, but to provide that compelling and considerate moment to the reader. So for this example, we'll use another case studies in sport management case, as I mentioned. This case is authored by myself and my co-author team, and it's entitled, "Oh Captain, My Captain," using social network analysis to help coaching staff identify the leadership of a national sports team. In this particular case, I'll fast forward the details of the exposition stage, but it features a non-fictitious case of Canada women's senior basketball team and the non-fictitious situation of coaching staff trying to think about the leadership core of their team. Now, in the fictitious element here, the coaching staff goes to our main character and asks for help to identify whom should compose that leadership group. And so there is an inciting incident here. We know who the main character is already. That's from the exposition stage. We know that we're talking about Canada basketball. We know we're talking about the senior national women's team and that they're practicing and they're getting ready for an international competition rather. We know all those details. The inciting incident that then happens is when the coaches go to the main character and say, look, we need your help to identify the core because we believe there are certain high quality characters in this room or on our team, but we want a different way to arrive at the answer. And so again, just a little bit of a fast forward, in that particular situation, the main character is then tasked with utilizing data and data analysis, specifically social network analysis, to consider trust levels, leadership characteristics, and other variables to determine quantitatively whom might compose the leadership core of the basketball team in question. So again, we have an inciting incident. The coach is going to the main character asking for help. It doesn't have to be an elongated incident. It doesn't need to be an incident that is necessarily pages upon pages, but it is an important element within our pyramid and our linear pyramid device to get to a place where we can now start to build. And that leads us into our third stage, which is the rising action. As the narrative ensues, the story builds. This is where key details are explicitly or subtly mentioned, or other data points may or may not appear. And those data points may or may not be relevant, but they are data points that exist and that are introduced in this rising action period. Another way to qualify this, or to characterize this, I should say, is by referring to this as the puzzle pieces, or what I personally subscribe to. I like to refer to these moments as dropping the breadcrumbs. And in dropping breadcrumbs, the hope here is that the case author are creating data points for which the reader and or audience are generally looking at the case and perhaps identifying key moments that they might be able to use to build responses to or perhaps evidence and ammunition for answers later on. But we'll get to that in a few moments' time. What's most important to recognize here is that breadcrumbs or puzzle pieces, regardless of the terminology that you use, they are a very important device. You may use them to purposely mislead the reader, or perhaps provide additional clarity or context in some situations. So numbers can really be useful, and numbers never lie until you purposely make the numbers, if you use the numbers to get to a misleading or potentially nefarious point. And one example of this from case studies in sport management is the case entitled Saving the Life of a National Sport Organization with Strategy and Governance. And that was authored by Milena Perron. And it's one of our newer cases in case studies in sport management. So feel free to access that. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But here for the rising action, what I'd like to identify is one of those key breadcrumb pieces. So again, fast forwarding the exposition and the inciting incident. In this particular case, what happens is there is a main character who works for an organization called Endurance Canada, the national governing body for endurance sports in Canada, so completely fictitious. And what ends up happening is this person is hired as CEO, the main character rather, is hired as their new CEO and director. And the board of directors has said, that we need you to come up with a new vision to execute our strategic plan that will save the life of the organization because the financial window does not look quite clear. And as we fast forward to the details and get to the rising action, one of those, in the rising action, one of those breadcrumbs is the data point that's brought up, which is, quote, Endurance Canada's funding comes from Sport Canada and Own the Podium. Now, to the average person, to the unbeknown to some, that might just be a sentence that exists in the story that is mundane or irrelevant. But to another person, or perhaps to the instructor and case writers, this point was purposefully put. There was strong intentionality by dropping this breadcrumb or puzzle piece into the narrative during this rising action stage. And that purpose could be to add ammunition, to arm the reader, in this case students, with the ammunition to provide clarity to an answer later on, saying, look, if most of our funding comes from these sources, perhaps we need to do a better job of building the relationship with these two stakeholders. Again, that is just one example, but it is a perfect example of how a breadcrumb, which might seem so insignificant, that might seem so benign and irrelevant, one sentence can mean so much to the reader. And that's why it's so incredibly useful as a literary device for case authors to think about dropping certain breadcrumbs in the rising action for the reader to pick up on later, or perhaps to believe are benign and not pick up on later. Another way to think about this is the treasure map. So if you are ultimately hoping that the reader or the learner will go through the case narrative and eventually find the buried treasure, you need to drop clues throughout the rising action to allow them to get to the X marks the spot. And that leads us to one of the most well-known parts of Freytag's pyramid, the climax event. The case narrative reaches the high point for the protagonist, main characters, or even potentially other characters, side characters in the scenario that they find themselves engaged in. So this is a critical opportunity to highlight the problem that has come to light. As we think about forming our case studies, when we think about problem-based learning, the climax truly aligns and is congruent with that problem-based learning foundation, insofar as we want that problem or incident to truly come to fruition at this moment in the case narrative. And so again, utilizing our case studies in sport management example for today, this case, co-authored by myself and my colleagues, former colleagues at the University of Ottawa, is entitled Ambush by Dre, a case study of the National Football League and the challenges arising from conflicting sponsorship strategies. Again, just as a quick fast forward, the case focuses on the situation of the National Football League, the NFL in the United States, and one of their core sponsors, Bose, in the headphones and sort of sound wireless category, and how Beats by Dre, an Apple Music or Apple technology-based sub-company, has been ambushing the official sponsorship by sponsoring individual NFL athletes over time. What ends up happening in the case is the commissioner of the National Football League, Roger Goodell, the head of the National Football League Players Association, DeMaurice Smith, and the CEO of Bose, whose name is escaping me at the moment, but all three of those key players, although they are non-fictitious, they get together on a conference call for fictitious discussion. And that is the climax, the conference call between those three major stakeholder leaders. And that's the critical piece here. That's the climax event to this particular case. So the details are brought up in that exposition phase. There is an inciting incident with Mr. Goodell. There is a rising action where breadcrumbs are dropped. but ultimately it reaches the pinnacle when the three key leaders of the stakeholder groups here come together on their conference call and begin to engage in the more concrete, more direct and explicit conversation. And after we reach that climax point, which again, many of you might already be in tune with from your favorite stories or music or television shows and media, you might be comfortable with the climax event. The following action, though, is an important piece here because it allows us to bridge to our resolution. And we'll get to that momentarily. But after reaching our pinnacle, the case narrative starts to slowly wind down, tying off contextual pieces or other elements that are required to land the story softly before we reach that resolution phase. Another way to put this is we need the rest of the dominoes to drop. New ideas, new characters or events should not necessarily be introduced here. You're not necessarily trying to purposely mislead by introducing new things, new ideas, new pieces. Those are elements and characteristics that you would want to introduce in not only the exposition phase potentially, but certainly the rising action. This is the moment where we're tying a bow, where we're making clarifications, where we're easing the reader down so that they can come off the high of the climax, then get to that resolution phase, which we'll talk about momentarily. The example of the following action here is from one of the most popular, or at least most read case studies in sport management, the only sport management teaching case journal that we have, and that is Case Studies in Sport Management. And that's entitled A Case Study on Power and Politics in Organizations. And that's co-authored by Florian Hemme and Marlene Dixon. And again, we'll fast forward through some of the details to get to the following action. But after the climax event, which was the meeting between the new CEO and the new executives at the firm, the protagonist, James, is summoned to go to the Go Sports headquarters to provide his report. So in that summoning period, the authors start to wind down the case. We were at that highest of highs with our case narrative, the meeting with the executives, the meeting with the team, understanding the details, and now the board of directors are summoning James to their next board meeting to provide the report and provide feedback. So in that summoning, we start to wind down, we're easing the reader slowly but surely and getting them to a place where they can then provide that feedback, and that is our resolution phase. Or is it? Now, again, if you go back to Freytag's pyramid, we're talking about resolving the story. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. But one of the unique features of the case study, at least from a teaching perspective, is that there's a beginning and a middle, but is there truly an end? The great thing about our case studies is that there might be an end, or there could be many different endings. So it's a bit flexible, it's a bit amenable, depending on how students and learners think about providing their discussion, think about how they provide clarity to the moment in time. And so this is where our case studies deviate from Freytag's pyramid, where we don't necessarily have an end point, but where we have what we'll call a discussion point. And that's where students are tasked with addressing key questions that are posed to them. So it's not necessarily an end to the story, it's a let's see what happens. And we'll stick with Hemme and Dixon's case. That's the very popular example that I had a moment ago in Case Studies in Sport Management, a case on power and politics. And after the CEO, James, is summoned to the the next board of directors meeting, there is, again, that winding down period, but eventually the narrative concludes and provides a sort of so what ending to the reader, but then subsequently is followed by a set of discussion questions. And the narrative in this particular situation ends what we'll call a bit abruptly, but it allows for more sort of rhetorical, but then explicit unpacking of what is next, and allowing the reader and the learner specifically to work through these discussion questions and perhaps in some cases even answer them. And so you can see some of the main questions here. What's the main issue? What are who are the competing individuals rather? Using French and Raven's taxonomy, identify the power sources at play here, identify and analyze problems created between the organizational members, analyze potential motivations between the uses of power, and who would you identify as the most powerful in this case? Now, some of these questions could just exist as food for thought. We'll touch base upon that in our third and final workshop session about the teaching note or the instructor's note. But what's critical here is that at our discussion point, the story doesn't necessarily end, but we hit a critical piece where the learner has to discuss what happens next. So as we overview those elements of Freytag's pyramid, the device that is so useful for playwrights, for authors, not just in academia, but of course in the visual and arts mediums, I should say, we are storytellers. With our case narrative, we are telling a story, and those stories are meant to be compelling, and they're meant to be considerate. And you can utilize Freytag's pyramid to help you in unpacking or unfolding the key pieces of your story. But do recall that as I say on screen here, you only see what you see. And that's a riff on one of my favorite quotes from a colleague of mine and the former associate editor of Case Studies in Sport Management, Dr. Christopher Chard, who loves to tell learners, you only know what you know. I love to use that riff, you only see what you see. And what I mean by that is the reader will only see what you write in the case narrative. Now, of course, there's what's written explicitly and also what's not written explicitly, but that's sort of written between the lines, so to speak. But even that is a device within itself. And we have to remember that the reader will only see explicitly what we put on the paper. Now, of course, there are, as I mentioned, there are those implicit assumptions or derivations that could occur, but fundamentally what you show, what you decide to closet or hide or purposefully omit are choices that you are making as the storyteller. And so it is crucial to be consistently considerate and careful with your consideration of those choices in order to achieve that compelling and considerate narrative. So if you are truly wanting to be considerate and compelling, you need to be intimate with the details that you are purposefully and explicitly putting in, hiding, or purposefully leaving out. And so the key takeaway message here is that the details matter. Whether you call them puzzle pieces, breadcrumbs, clues, or hints, or something else that's similar. One of the important takeaways from today's workshop is that the details do matter. Every sentence matters in how you bridge ideas together, certainly, but also whether or not there are data points that could be interpreted, utilized, operationalized, or even forgotten by the reader. Details in the narrative can be used to confuse, as I alluded to earlier, or even purposely mislead in some situations. They can also be utilized as that ammunition to arm the learner with evidence to support their claims. Great case writers are thoughtful and intimate with how they approach the breadcrumbs they leave for students. Some of the most well-adopted cases we see in case studies in sport management are just that. Cases that are not only profound from a contextual standpoint, but are considerate and compelling because they not only utilize the devices of Freytag's pyramid, but thought intimately about what they were putting into the rising action, to the falling action, into the inciting incident were important details to mention to arm the learner as they go forward. So they can be explicit things like tables and charts. They could be implicit things. They could be things that are sort of embedded into a sentence or a paragraph. We see variety and diversity, with respect to how authors introduce breadcrumbs, whether they are subtle or, as I mentioned, more explicit. In some instances, case authors may even provide supplemental documents to their case narrative. Full documents or full what's the word I'm looking for here? Documents that are standalone. That's it. Documents that stand alone, that only exist almost as if they were an appendix, with additional tables, additional charts, additional snapshots from a website or an article, a newspaper article, whatever the case may be, in order to provide additional context or clarity, or to add those additional puzzle pieces, breadcrumbs, or clues, whether they are used or not. Now, as I alluded to off the top today, when we talked about the balancing act between the narrative and the instructor's note or the teaching note, one of the challenges of authoring a teaching case study in sport management is this existential dilemma of, do I start with my story or do I start with the instructor's note, the teaching note, the sort of structural plan, as it were? And there, again, as I mentioned, there is no one right answer. There are some authors out there who like to begin with writing their narrative, at the end dropping the breadcrumbs in that narrative and hanging on to those, and after completing the write-up of their narrative, proceed to then write the structural plan in the teaching note, which we'll talk about in our third workshop. Conversely, there are authors who like to do the reverse and start with that structural plan for teachers, educators, instructors. Start with the plan, know what could be said or how a lesson may unfold and manifest, and work backwards, sort of reverse linearity, and then begin to write a case narrative that is compelling and considerate post the writing of the instructor's note. And then there are folks who author both simultaneously. So if you happen to be one of those, advanced techie folks that's got two screens, or if you're like myself, someone with an ultra wide monitor, and you're going, you know what, I'm gonna have two documents up at the same time. Maybe that's the right choice for you to work on your case narrative whilst you also complete the structural teaching plan simultaneously. Regardless of which of the three options you choose, you need to just ensure from a case narrative perspective that you are hearkening back to what was said, that the case narrative needs to be compelling and it needs to be considerate. Now, finally, one other issue that is worth mentioning is that context is relevant. Now, especially in the narrative. Now, context, when we talk about sport management teaching cases, can sometimes consume the narrative. It may consume the case insofar as the reader forgets to look at some of the key breadcrumbs or puzzle pieces that may explicitly or implicitly emanate and manifest through the narrative. And so, that being said, please make sure that context doesn't overshadow the rest of the details that are important in making a good case overall. But on that note, context is important, and case narratives are a great way to introduce students to new contexts, whether that's in sport, so new sports such as cricket, lacrosse, pickleball, whether they're new sectors, so whether it's parasport, whether it's thinking about adaptive sport or even modified sport, or even just new geographic regions, setting a case outside of the global north and in the global south. And so please consider, as you're authoring going forward, whether or not your specific case could actually have a different context. Because when you work through the foundations that we learned about in our first workshop, there is an opportunity for you to achieve the skills, the problem-based learning outcomes, and maybe some of the soft and hard skills that are top of mind for your readers and learners out there, not just in your classrooms, but other classrooms, using different contexts that might be unbeknown to you, or even unbeknownst to your students and learners. So think about whether or not the context that you're operationalizing is not just relevant, because certainly it would be, but whether or not it could actually be different, and whether it would be useful to consider amplifying another situational context in another geographic or sport or sector where we can maximize learning for students and expose our learners to new sports, new sectors, and new geographic regions at the same time. And that's the case narrative. Thank you so much for listening. And that's the end of today's content.